Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix. What's new on the shelf? Well, Skin Elegies by Lance Olsen. Let's check it out. And spoiler alert, let's get into it. I'm super stoked to be able to talk about this book. Lance Olsen is an interesting figure in writing and literature because he's very much focused on what could be called the experimental tradition. He's thinking about the modernists and postmodernists and the avant-garde and how, not just how do we use language, but how do we put stories together? How do we put narratives together? So he's actually asking a meta question of what is narrative, rather than, as some contemporary writers do, language is detached from the narrative, and it's more about the way in which, it's less about the way in which we tell the story, and more about the story being told. And so Lance, as part of this experimental tradition, is definitely thinking about it in a different way than how most people probably approach narrative and writing stories and telling stories. And so to give you an example of what he's doing, he's focusing on moments, very crucial moments in the 20th century. He's focused on bits and parts of history. So, to give you an example, and his kind of moving through time, he has one chapter that is the 10th of June of 2015, and then he jumps all the way to the 8th of August 1974, moves to 11th of September 2001, to the 8th of August 1974, to the 20th of April 1999. And so what's interesting is not only is he focusing on moments in the 20th century across geographical locations, as well as moments in time, and even actual perspectives and points of view, he's literally telling multiple stories at the same time. And this is really interesting because it's a non-linear technique. He's focusing very much on the way in which we put stories together, the way in which we tell the stories, how we use language, and where the actual episodes in the story are. And so knowing Lance, he's very interested in the 20th century, and so he does talk about different parts of history, such as the murder of John Lennon. And it's really interesting how he's able to focus on different moments in time, which also includes the 21st century. And so, for instance, there's a narrative about an individual who is a boy, who is gay, and living somewhere in the Middle East, and he's trying to immigrate to Berlin to literally be safer. And so, the reason why I bring this up is because he's definitely all across time. And he even jumps all the way to 2072, which is in the future, of course, so the 29th of October of 2072 at 10:30 a.m. And so he's jumping all through time. And I find that really interesting as a way of telling a story, or rather stories, because all of this comes together in a whole, and yet seems to be fragmented and dispersed in that sense. In an interesting way to have multiple narratives, instead of just instead of just one narrative being told. And so, yeah, so it's an interesting way of telling stories. And so, this is just my take on it, because it's very possible that Lance Olsen meant something else when he was writing this book. But I take it as not just one voice, but multiple voices, which is an interesting way of telling stories. Because I think about this a lot in my own practice of, it's not just my perspective. There are so many other perspectives with which you can explore. And my personal take is all throughout history, even if history is less important in an experimental novel, it's still nonetheless an interesting way of looking at it for me, because it's like I'm interested in all perspectives. I want to see the continuity, or the lack of continuity, between various perspectives, and how all of that is put together. And so I think it's definitely an interesting thing to keep in mind, that it's not just one perspective, but a multitude of perspectives, a multitude of voices. And I like that, because it's a little bit more inclusive and it takes you out of the ego. And it's an interesting way of writing stories because you're focusing on multiple elements and multiple voices rather than just one voice. Now I wanted to spotlight one of the narratives in the story, in this overall book, which is the boy who is migrating to Berlin. And it's really interesting because I actually think it's the most emotionally charged narrative in this series of narratives, because it's very simple, straightforward first-person narrative where you get this perspective from this boy who wants to be in a safer place. And I think that's really interesting to capture the realization that gay people in more repressive cultures tend to stifle people's expressions and self-expressions. And so that is really interesting to think about, and I think that Lance Olsen captures it in a very unique and emotional way, because you find that you're caring about this character. And I think that it's really interesting. And so I like this narrative probably the most throughout the whole book, even though ironically for an experimental novel, it's the most straightforward part. But it is the part that I enjoyed the most. But to give you an example of kind of what he's doing, it isn't just the narrative itself and what's being told, like specifically what the story is, it's also the diction used, or the episode being accounted for, such as John Lennon's murder, or the Battle of Berlin, or the invention of the internet. It's focused very much on the words used, so the diction, as well as the point of view, and the way in which all of that is conveyed. And that also includes typography. So, like Danielewski, who sees writing as being an interesting way of telling a story, but also by thinking of language specifically which is set free on the page, so to speak. Danielewski is a good example of that. And Lance Olsen is thinking about typography in the way in which he has the words and letters actually on the page. And I think that it's very fascinating to do that, because it's not just blocks of text, it's also the way in which you spread it on the page. And this is actually more common in poetry, so I think of E. E. Cummings as an example of someone who's thinking about the way that the poems look on the page, and yet it's done in prose. And so, for example, one of the narratives is told in columns. In another one, the words are very much scattered across the page. You have names, which are scattered variously across the page. And you also have accounts, so you have like blocks, the way in which Lance Olsen is writing from different perspectives and having blocks. And it's just interesting the way that he does that, because it's often utilized in poetry. I don't think it's so much utilized in prose, such as in narrative. And so I would say that this is actually a fairly new technique with thinking about how the words look on the page, and then therefore how we read it and the emotion that's evoked. Now, Lance Olsen is interesting as a writer because he was very much influenced by Samuel Beckett, James Joyce, and Thomas Pynchon, writers who are very much thinking about narrative and what you dispense with. So it's just really interesting because I wouldn't say that this book has plot, it rather is plots. There are multiple plots, but even then it's not told in necessarily a linear way. And so Lance Olsen is constantly thinking about what you can disperse from, what you can diverge from, and what you can get rid of to be able to tell a story. And I think that that's very powerful. It's a unique way of hearkening to a way in which people like Samuel Beckett and James Joyce were writing, which is thinking about the very way in which you put the narratives together. And so I think that's really interesting to think about overall, because it's not something that's often thought about in writing, because I think we often think of it in terms of linear narrative. So it's this happened, so A happened, then B happened, then C happened, and then that was the resolution. But with this, it's more, how do we actually tell stories? And I love that question. And I'll admit, in my own writing, I try to think about that, though I find it harder sometimes, because I'm not really part of an experimental tradition. I'm definitely not a part of the avant-garde. But I want to tell stories that do challenge the reader, depending on what I'm writing, because I want to be able to say, this is the way that I'm putting this together, even if it's a different way than other people normally would have told their story. So I think it's really powerful. Now, I get a lot out of this book. There's a lot that I see as being expressed in this book and in some of the writers I've mentioned, where I think a lot about how I can incorporate multiple voices in my own writing. How can I make my narrative exciting or more unexpected, unpredictable? And it seems to me that I don't always know how to do that, because when you're writing, you're always on the edge. You don't know how it's going to be perceived or received. Often it's a situation where you don't quite know what story you're even telling. And so for me, there's that constant back and forth between the more conscious elements of storytelling that maybe we've internalized, or maybe even a part of the way that we're actually wired to tell stories with the way that the brain works. But it's also that tension between how do you make this a little bit more nonlinear or a little bit more surprising, or thinking about narrative at large. And I think that's interesting because there's a lot of ways to tell stories. And so I like putting Lance Olsen's book next to some of the books that have influenced me. As you can see from my bookshelf, there's obviously a lot of books that have influenced me. And I really like thinking about this book in the context of other voices and other stories being told. And I think that's probably the strength of this book and the interpretations that can be made about this book, which is that there's a depth there. There is this idea that we're all kind of this multiplicity, and we want to know different perspectives. It can't just be the ego-driven one perspective that we often have. There are multiple voices. And I don't know if this was exactly Lance Olsen's actual thought about what he was doing, though it could have been. But at least that's what I interpret. Because when I'm writing, I want to capture the multitude. I want to capture not just my own perspective, but a multitude of perspectives. There's so much value in being able to capture different points of view. And I don't know if my writing's any good. I don't know that my writing can reach the depths that some of these other books that I've read have reached. But it's certainly something inspiring to think about, because it makes me think, what can I do that might be more unique? And not necessarily forcing it, obviously, because that wouldn't be helpful either, but just thinking about how you put it together. And so I like the idea of nonlinearity. I like the idea of having different points in time. I like the idea of having different perspectives and points of view, and using language in a different way, and using topography in a different way. And so the way that we put these stories together, I think, is very interesting. And I think it's a question that's constantly worth asking. So yeah, I'm super stoked that you stopped by. I hope that you enjoyed. Check out my books and my other videos on my YouTube channel. And yeah, happy reading. Thank you.